Well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to be joined right now by Daniel Bessner. Daniel Bessner is somebody who you could find in many, many places. Jacobin, the great American Prestige podcast, and also writing in foreign exchange, among many, many other things. How you doing, Danny?
Good, man. How are you guys?
Dude,
Doing
it's
great. Don't forget Hinge Points with
Yes,
oh Lord,
Matt Christman.
how could
Yeah,
I?
I'm
Points in the Chapo feed. Check that out.
exactly.
I'm sure everyone listening has checked that out. Thank you.
Yeah, it's nice of you to help them out. They're struggling for content.
No, I mean, for people who aren't familiar, I'm sure most of y'all are. Danny was also a very dear member of the TMBS crew, so it's always great to have these reunion shows. And happy for you. I mean, this is a second or third time over here with us on Left Reckoning so far. So you're making your appearances here too.
Yeah, of course. Happy to come on whenever.
Well, I had you on. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of different things we could talk about, but you had this piece that you put up, and if Matt, you could put this on the screen for everybody. Yep. In Foreign Exchange, which is a great Substack that y'all should be following, called The End of Mass Politics. And I'll just read out the first bit of it. If Americans feel disconnected from their government and their communities, perhaps that's because they are. If social media is any indication, and despite what people might say or hope, it is very much the major feelings experienced by most Americans are dislocation and unease. In the last 20 years, the U.S. government has lurched from failure to failure to the point where a repetition of American-led disasters, Afghanistan, Iraq, Katrina, the Great Recession, Libya, Trump, reads like a negative doxology. After living through Washington's inability and or unwillingness to address adequately the COVID-19 pandemic, either at home or abroad over the past 2 years, many Americans have resigned themselves to a reality in which their lives are getting and will continue to get worse. Could you start... just to help us all understand so we're on the same page, what you mean by mass politics and what you mean by sort of ending?
Sure. So if you look at what's generally taken to be the start of our own era, let's say the post-World War I period, you see the rise of a number of things like the radio, things like very cheap printing presses and methods of distribution, mass political parties that are meaningfully similar to what exists today. Lots of differences too, but meaningfully similar. And it was the age of the masses. Now, if you go back to the late 19th century, people are already talking about the masses, but the general take is that, the modern era that we exist in today really began in the 1920s. And one of the defining characteristics of that era was this thing that we call mass politics, where people listen to mass things like the radio, or people engage in mass political organizing or mass protests or mass propaganda events like the Nuremberg rallies, where you see masses of people, they come together and they have a meaningful relationship to politics. I think that the actual history of the United States since World War II and beginning during World War II really has been a successful attempt to basically disconnect people from power. And one of the elements of that was essentially removing political authority from the demos, or the public, or the people. And that was it started first in the most important areas, which, or at least the areas viewed as most important by the American state: foreign policy and macroeconomic policy, which most people have ordinary people have no say on. And you had things like the creation of new institutions within the actual state, the CIA, the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Department of Defense in the late 1940s. And at the same time, you had the parallel creation of think tanks and a network of think tanks and what are referred to as parastatal organizations, organizations that serve state functions, but are not officially connected to the state, even though they're mostly funded by the state. And you could say for things like weapons manufacturers, right? They create weapons for sale abroad, but also they do quite a bit for the United States government. And one can meaningfully say, like, these are things that the government should do. And so over the course of the last, 40 or 50 years since the 1970s, you've had the increasing, what Daniel Rogers calls the age of fracture, the coming apart of a lot of our social base. like, bowling alone, all those arguments about, the dislocation, the alienation of American life caused by things like the development of suburbs, which are really a product of the 50s and onward, caused by, the focusing on the car as this ideal of American masculinity, the creation of the interstate highway system, which allows you to have these cars, the creation of the suburbs, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this increasing alienation of American life, plus the sort of power structure that I described a little bit earlier. Then you have in the last 5-10 years, and particularly on the left, what I would call a fetishization of protest, the fetishization of mass movement. But I would say that if you look at what has actually happened empirically, there's been and also, I should add earlier, of course, the decline of labor unions, which were never super high in the United States. And the United States always had more right wing labor unions than comparative places in Europe. But there's still the labor had a seat at the table, and that was a real thing. And that has obviously declined in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So what you have today is that people basically arguing in favor of particular political strategies like mass protests. And I think we saw in the summer of 2020 some of the largest mass protests in history, certainly in American history, probably in world history, particularly repeated and ongoing, et cetera. But you haven't seen a corresponding change in the actual politics or an actual policy. You have people talking about politics all the time on Twitter. And in real life, oftentimes, there's a well-documented partisan sorting of the parties where liberals are now Democrats and conservatives are now Republicans. So people talk about politics all the time, but there seems to be almost no connection between any sort of discussion and actual policy change. You have this network of, where we're all a part of, the constant podcasts. More people talk and think about politics in a sense. It's part of their entertainment diet and probably at any other time in human history, but there seems to be no effect on political change. And I think that's one of the reasons is because we have and then my final thing is that I think like everyone's going a little nuts these days. I think that's pretty clear, and that's due to COVID, but that's also due to a lot of things, the end of Birdie, 2008, et cetera. But one of the reasons I think people are kind of losing their minds is that there's a ontological disconnect between talking and thinking about nothing but politics and seeing nothing change, and seeing Chuck Schumer tweet, get rid of student loans, Biden, or whatever it may be. And so I think what we need to do is really think if these mass metaphors, the metaphors of the masses or the literal strategy of the masses really make sense for how power is operationalized in our actually existing society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good summary, especially of where we're at now, and I'm really happy to have you on because this is the kind of question that I've been wrestling with, for a while, both on the show and also with Michael on TMBS. Okay, so we can see that people have a lot of personal passion, but I think a lot of people have a difficulty sort of imagining what politics actually looks like, right? Rather than it just sort of being a space of individual expression. But before we even get to sort of critiquing everybody for being too online on that kind of stuff, I wanted to note another part of the social decline though that you were mentioning earlier. When you do look at the historical difference in this country, I think one thing you can really see right now, and something that the right wing is taking a lot of advantage of, is the relationship that people feel to all institutions, but especially ones that are supposedly democratically controlled, like the whole CRT freak out and the stuff that's going on at school boards, right? You listen to the way that people are talking and you don't see this kind of democratic, feeling of pride or control over the school system. They talk about the school system as if it's something that's sort of imposed, top down on them, rather than it being something that's sort of community or socially owned, right? I don't know. You compare that to some of the earlier parts of American history, people sort of had an understanding of the public space as something where we could interact with. When people are going and interacting with it, they're not treating it as it's something that's collectively owned by us. It's something that's sort of been put upon them that they're resisting now, right?
Yeah, and I think you see there was a really good piece that came out in the New Republic around the time of Occupy. I forgot the name of the author, but that discussed the increasing privatization of private space. Like Zuccotti Park was privatized, and so then you have just sort of this demassification sort of trickling down from decisions elites made about the American state, and decisions, they made macroeconomic decisions without essentially consulting the American people, and contributed to these dislocations. And so I think what you're describing is exactly part of the process that I'm talking about here as well.
Yeah, and it's just difficult, to start to build a roadmap for the way out of it, because it's something that I try to note on this show a lot too is that, like, yeah, as you're saying, like the creeping of like private space over public space is something that plays a huge role in this. I mean, it's sort of like a Twitter meme now, but it is a very like viable and important argument. People, like show a picture of like their downtown area and say like, show me where I can hang out for free, right? And you start to see how that's very disappearing even in urban centers, let alone if you're like the vast majority of Americans now who lives in a kind of like suburban area. I mean, there's nothing truly there's very little around us that we can sort of engage in, just like public space walking around. But like social organizations, like this is a big part of neoliberalization, is not just removing people from like state power, but also removing us from like social lives in general, right? I mean, like we really are living in my opinion in like the realization of the Thatcher era. And I feel like COVID has really made this worse, in the sense that when Thatcher says like there is no society, there's individuals in the family, right? More and more people being sort of stuck at home really does feel like a kind of dark realization of the Thatcherite dream. And we're seeing that under in a period of time when early Biden administration, it was like neoliberalism is over, we're entering into a new age, right? We really in a lot of ways have entered into like a true encapsulation of a lot of the neoliberal principles.
Yeah, and I think that's because, as I put in the article, I think capitalism is one. I mean, and you guys mentioned hinge points. In a certain sense, I think like what people were actually talking about in the 19th century was not like a social democracy or what the Soviet Union became, right? They were talking about genuine, total new organization of society led by people who are not alienated from their labor and who control the levers of power democratically. And that dream died relatively early in the 20th century. So we're kind of living in that aftermath. And so we're seeing like what capitalism does without even an ideological rival in the Soviet Union. And we could talk about what the Soviet Union was or what it wasn't, but it was certainly perceived as an anti-capitalist ideological rival, and to some degrees it was. But absent that, you're seeing capitalism on steroids, and this is what we get. But the problem is no one believes in anything. There's no other ideological alternatives. So you have this malaise where people just basically become obsessed with like the processes of democratic politics and like bureaucratic organization, which is wild. I mean, it's not interesting, and it's in a sense not properly political. Even engaging in that, you're engaging in the fact that it is that it is by focusing on the technical and the sort of progress elements, you're actually engaging in the type of end of history rhetoric about the questions of politics have been decided, and it's all technical. And I think you see it with sort of like the played out extremism that is, reflected online, which I think, I mean, I disagree with people. I think Twitter is online, particularly when so many of our of real life. I think that particularly because so much of our life is mediated through social media, Twitter or another thing. But the problem is real life is we don't affect shit. So just like on Twitter, we don't affect shit because in real life, we don't affect shit. And I'll end on this one. I mean, voting is also like a very weak form of democracy. It's choosing which people rule you. This is a very impoverished understanding of democracy. It's been dominant in this country since the 1930s. So like even our like great, democratic imagination is like we get to choose which aristocrats rule us in a sense, becoming increasingly aristocratic. So yeah, it's a pretty grim moment. And I think we need to think our way out of here.
I mean, we all love Daddy Bernie, right? Because he certainly changed the game. But this is a point that I've been making time and time again. Is like every once in a while he would hint at this, right? Where he would say, obviously the slogan "It's not me, us" is great, but when he would expand on that, and he would say, "What I mean by that is if I come into power and I want to do any of the things that I'm running on, I'm going to need like mass mobilization of society." And I think that analysis is correct in the way, like to be able to challenge the state, power, like that is what we would need. But it's sort of laughable to say it at that point, because I'm sorry, in 2020 we were nowhere close to that being like, I'm sorry, I'd have a hard time imagining Bernie winning either 16 or 20. Just unfortunately, I try to be an optimist, but I'm a little pessimist on that. But even if we did win, I feel like it would have been a very disappointing experience, right? Because Bernie Sanders coming up against this like very, very powerful state, without having these kind of like mass movements that are capable of like using the social power of people. We were nowhere close to having that developed. And, maybe we could do it quickly. I don't know. but I feel like that's sort of left a lot of people in a state of confusion, right? Because the closest that a lot of people felt coming to political change were these, primary campaigns within the Democratic Party, which is not our party, and was trying to do everything it could to sort of derail and destroy these from within. So I feel like one of the difficult things that we have right now is, like, again, it's not just that we don't have the structures that we need. I think a lot of people have a hard time imagining what those structures would actually need to be
Right.
able to
And so,
implement change.
well, it's not even so, like, to me, capital has been enormously successful about reformulating labor relations to the point where the
Mm,
sociality and solidarity upon which any sort of organization relies is basically impossible. If you're working for Uber, or you're working for Uber Eats, or whatever, any one of these gig economy jobs, you're hyper alienated. You don't even
mhm,
have a workplace. You have several different bosses, which are really just computers, who are not even your bosses. And so that sort of sociality,
mhm.
on which any organization relies, is basically impossible. And so I think the left, broadly speaking, oftentimes just says organize. Okay, how? And this is why I think you see a lot of the large organization efforts happening at the few places where there is that sort of sociality, at an Amazon warehouse, at a Starbucks, at a graduate school,
Mm,
these centralized places where people come and actually meet. And that'll be like really, really difficult to happen due to various laws and horrible things that make it very difficult to organize. But most of the economy, or increasing amounts of the economy, are a different form of work.
mm.
And that's true for younger people, who are oftentimes the engine of these types of organizational efforts, and that's a real problem. So I think, I didn't mean the end of mass politics piece to be blackpilling at all, but I think, like, as the science of historical materialism teaches us, you have to know what the fuck is going on.
Yeah.
Where does power actually lie? And that's the first step in the analysis, and then you go from there.
I've been really deep in Christopher Hill, English Civil War stuff, and it's one of the interesting things about that is if you were sort of a techno utopian, you could argue like the printing press and look at the word getting out to people, and look at this sort of stuff. More and more people pamphleteering, and all of a sudden you get this revolutionary ferment. And yeah, like you say now we have sort of what would seem to be as good of a shot as a new version of the printing press and the internet. Your theory as to why it's not leading to that, basically because this time it's basically unveiled by the capitalists and controlled by capitalists entirely? Or what's your theory about like
Well, there's
that
that
sort of thing?
sort of the Habermasian theory that liberal exchange of ideas is going in the marketplace of ideas is going to lead to some sort of transcendence. And I don't think that's true. I mean, going back to the printing press, people were arguing the same thing in the 1920s as print became cheaper. Were arguing the
Mhm,
same thing with television. People were arguing with the same thing with the internet. It's the same shit. Whenever there's a new, easier form of communication that allows you to reach numbers of people, the assumption is that there's going to be a function of that will be some sort of democratizing thing, and that's just empirically untrue. And then the answer is like, why? And there's a million answers related to history, the organization of a society, who controls capital. Ideology is really critical. Religion is really critical. What people believe in, and so false consciousness. That was essentially an idea developed to understand why didn't the working class do what Marx said that they were going to do. And so what becomes clear, I think, analytically, is that class position doesn't lead to any necessary politics,
mm,
and there's mediating ideologies, which is why vulgar Marxism doesn't work in actual history, because history is more complex and there's a feeding back between the base and the superstructure. So, Matt, to answer your question, there's no one answer. You'd have to look at the moment and then say these are the 45 different things that prevent communist utopia, in my opinion.
I mean, yeah, I mean, again, I agree with you too that, like, this isn't about trying to blackpill people. It's sort of trying to understand, like, the stage and the historical moment that we're at. And I will just note to people that even though some of this stuff might feel disappointing because we're not achieving the things that we want to at the moment, um, the life that like, as someone who became I'm a little bit younger, but, like, I became a socialist before this kind of media apparatus, or really DSA was a large organization before Bernie Sanders, and it felt like a kind of little personal secret. And then Occupy happened, and it seemed like there were these movements, and this kind of this movement of like, I don't know, awakening of people. And it was certainly very exciting. And I think we're in a much stronger position now than we were, say, 10 years ago. Just in the sense of like people's awareness. And like, I feel like there has been a kind of unleashing of like hope and optimism on some level. But I think what a lot of people are learning the hard way, unfortunately, is that there are very, very winning in politics is not just about like sort of like flipping a switch in a lot of people's brains, or like having like the most perfectly constructed argument that's going to like, unlock like all of these different little social groups. It's the actual very difficult work of one, organizing, but also creating structures that can outlast sort of swells of like public opinion, right? So we saw these mass social movements at Occupy. We saw these mass uprisings, with Black Lives Matter and after the murder of George Floyd. But you have to ask yourself about what the kind of structural result of those things have been, right? And a big reason, I would argue, one of the big problems that we have is that we love movements, but we don't like structure, right? Like we love like the idea of people in the street, but when it comes to being able to communicate with those people after the fact, or being able to have some kind of message discipline, I mean, it dissipates very quickly.
And I think a lot of the political energy, for good and understandable reasons, because we are disconnected, on the left is a form of identitarian politics, because everything is a form of identitarian politics, because that is the age we live in. And I am not free of that. You are not free of that. No one is free of that. But this is why you see people fighting about like what form of communist they are.
Yes.
That is so, to me, silly when there's no communist movement. I always say it's like being an Aryan Christian in the 9th century. It's like this thing doesn't exist. So Arian for people, if you want to look into it, but it's like it's a movement that doesn't really exist anymore. So what are you even talking about? And that's because we are all personal brands, like blah 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 blah. All the structures indicate this. And so whether you're a Marxist, Leninist, a Maoist, third worldist, or a communist, it's like, what do you believe in utopia? Who gives a shit? It's just a form of identitarian posturing that is absolutely totally meaningless. And so people are angry, and so this is where it gets channeled.
I have a hot take on this too, that I get worried now that, and look, I studied philosophy at school. I'm super into all this kind of stuff, but I've been seeing a kind of psychoanalytic turn too on the left lately. Everyone's getting,
which always happens when the left loses, by the way.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah. Psychoanalysis was introduced into Marxism by the Frankfurt School because they're like, why the fuck did everyone fight each other in World War I? Literally, they say that. This is what Eric Fromm is talking about. I write about this in my book. If you want to look at the beginning of chapter 2 of my book, I go into like why did the Frankfurt School decide to? What did the Frankfurt School do? It brought in psychoanalysis and it brought in a critique of culture. Why? What just happened? World War I. What was supposed to happen? The workers were not supposed to murder each other on European battlefields. So this is a big explanation. The answer is turns out it's not just class. You have to introduce elements of the human mind and introduce elements of culture, right? And my problem with psychoanalysis is a problem of any sort of psychology, which is that it's universalizing. In some sense, it's ahistorical, but I do think it's somewhat useful in understanding what humans do in particular moments. But like the human mind is not a static object that what Freud said in 1895 or 1930, for that matter, will necessarily apply. Though I do think provides a very useful vocabulary for what people actually do.
I mean, damn, it's certainly interesting, but like, Lacan himself was very much against like using his models as like a basis of politics, right? Like he's pretty explicit about that, and it was his followers later who were like really pushed it. But that's I mean, I just wanted to note that because I see this as a kind of like, this is what happens after some feeling of, I don't know, left populism or mass movement that we saw under Bernie Sanders, is like, okay, now we need to retreat to like the individual, right? Which I think is the worst lesson to take from our recent losses. But before we, we could go for a while, but I want to make sure that we get to your points in the piece about the last 20 years. Matt, could you pull up the piece of foreign exchange. Sorry. I just want to read these bullet points because I think they're strong. I'd be curious if you had anything you want to add to them too. You got this up, Matt?
Yeah, it was 1 second. There it is.
Okay, so if you go down to the bullets, I'll read it for people who are listening. So what have the last 20 years demonstrated? The rich can get richer and the poor can get poorer without there being a serious reaction. People are as a whole unwilling to put their lives on the line for politics. Congress largely has abandoned its role in war making. The voice provided by social media is largely an illusion when it comes to affecting those um, who wield real power, while the mass media is more interested in circuses than in informing. There is not a clear link between popular protest and political reform. Those who control the Democratic Party feel no compunction to listen to their supposed constituents. For the moment, at least, capitalism has won, and its victory is totalizing. Excuse me. You don't need that many people to control and run the U.S. empire effectively. Trump taught us that very clearly. Of course, I do not wish to imply that the above realities are internal. Humans, as Marx rightly said, make their own histories, even if, as he added, we don't make them as we please. We live in a grim era where morbid symptoms abound. Our goal for the next decade must be to change that. And the only way to do so is to identify the present constellation of power in our society and strategize accordingly. If we do not, we will continue to suffer.
Yeah. Sounds like a genius wrote that.
I mean, I think in particular, like one of the most important bits I think in that list is when you note that there's not a clear link between popular protests and political reform, and I think that is one of the bigger illusions that I think a lot of like younger leftists get, and I just mean people who have only been thinking themselves as socialists or leftists or communists, for a few years, fall into, but also older folks do too. Because as I was saying before, like when I saw these mass movements of like Occupy and things like that, I was like, oh my Lord, like it's finally happening, and I get to live in history. And I was sort of blinded by the fact that just seeing people in the streets, just seeing people like giving a shit, really gave like, it blinded me to like the very serious structural problems with that movement, right? And it's something that Leo Panitch also notes too. It's one of my favorite lines of his, that he found one of the most encouraging things about the Sanders movement and the Corbyn movement was the move from what he called protest to politics.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like not the problem. I mean, I really like Panitch, right? I really like Chomsky. I really like all these guys, right? But they were just came of age in a totally different world, where seeing things like mass organization were possible. And I actually,
do you think mass organization is not possible? I might. I'd be curious.
Anything's possible, David.
Well, thank you very much.
Likely.
Yeah.
I think that I think it's very difficult, and I think that we've been talking about it. At least it's active since the recession and since Occupy. It's been over a decade. I think there have been a few gains. I think if we take a hard look at the how far we've gone forward, we've done very well on the podcasts, extremely well, very poorly in every other area.
Well, I mean, I'm curious as to what you think about this. I think one of the larger challenges is not just, we're always talking about reaching out to folks, right? I think like a big hurdle that we have is like the destruction of civil society, right? Like, where do you go in public? Yeah.
And I think that one thing that I had in this piece, now that I remember that Derek deleted, because he didn't think it was directly relevant, is like, when do revolutions actually happen? When do they? A lot of times, not going to say 90%, but a lot of times it's because of things like you don't have access to food. You can't get like calories or shelter, so those are oftentimes when you'll see like spontaneous revolutions, or in the case of like the Velvet Revolutions of the late 1980s, it's when this incredibly sclerotic structure that was an outside imperial power was controlling you. It's absent like extreme depredation, which we might see via climate change, but I don't think we'll see here, frankly. I think Kim Stanley Robinson I think we in the developed North are going to be mostly okay, at least for our lifetimes. Those sorts of changes don't really happen that often. You don't storm the Bastille. I suggest anyone who wants to read about the French Revolution, read what French peasants were eating. I think they were eating something called like black bread, which is bread which you had to soak in water for like 30 minutes to make it soft enough to chew, right? That's a big difference from being able to go to McDonald's and eat. So I also think like these changes, like we have these revolutionary moments, but like capitalism has been successful in certain things. That's providing cheap calories, cheap entertainment. What I actually think is going to happen, I think you're going to see increasing legalization of vices. I think you're going to start seeing the legalization of sex work. I think you're going to start seeing the legalization of cocaine, mushrooms, maybe even some form of opiates. We already have essentially addicted the American underclass to opiates anyway. So why not just make it the whole shebang? I think you're going to see things like that. And these aren't even going to be conscious choices. The algorithm is just going to be producing antibodies to protect itself. But I don't think unfortunately, it has to protect itself against much. Oh, and someone said in the post, Florida and Louisiana are going underwater. Yeah, certain parts of the country will be affected. Like we'll see city death. Like Miami might die in the city. I've encouraged people to look up the Louisiana map from like the map we have is from the New Deal. Like a quarter or even more of that state is now underwater compared to the maps. But yeah, on a whole, I think we'll be okay.
I mean, that is one thing, but I think even like on the level of communities and groups that are affected, like Matt Huber does make a really great point. Is like the kind of like social justice, like environmental movement. They use these terms like frontline communities, but the vast majority of people who live in these quote unquote frontline communities, when you do surveys, they don't consider themselves to be people who are going to be affected by climate change, right? So for people who think climate change is going to be like a political catalyst in and of itself, I think unfortunately are mistaken. Like that it will have the capacity to, like, at least in the United States, to have like a bottom up movement. I think it can definitely play a role for some people, right? But it won't do it for you. And like this is, I think, the big historical point that Danny is making too. Is like things can get really, really bad. And we can have the correct like social theory about like the structures and who's oppressing who, but that hasn't just been in and of itself like the engine or the fuel of revolt or revolution.
Yeah, people have to feel like it's worth putting their life on the line. That's hard. That's really hard to do. And like it's people like the way I would frame it, like if people were storming the Capitol and then 4 people were shot, instead of retreating, they'd continue. That's a revolutionary moment, and they keep on going because they're willing to die for a cause. I think that is I don't see that happening anytime on the American left anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we have to build the capacity. I mean, I think Ronan Burtenshaw over at Tribune has a good line. If anything, it's a challenge, right? It's like the job of the socialist left is to convince working class people that politics can change their lives. And I'll tell you right now that that's not a very common belief amongst working people. If anything, politics is a bad thing, because every time that politics enters in their life, there's a bad outcome for them. Things get worse, right? Whenever the state starts getting interested in your life, it's not necessarily been a positive experience for most people. Well, you want to give anybody some like roses and sunshine before you leave, or
well, I mean, like, it's an opportunity.
Take a shot.
it's somewhat exciting, right? Like, I think that the answers of the past clearly don't work. That's what anything has proven. So it's actually a time to think interestingly about things. I think there's a reason that a lot of our elders on the left are extremely elderly, because there wasn't a left for a long time. There's 70 plus. So hopefully we'll get some new people who more organically connected to what is going on in our society, and then what it means to live in front of a screen in a real way, which is what it is to be someone under 40. It's to live with a screen. And so that's a new sociality, and new opportunities, as every change results in new opportunities and new drawbacks.
Well, I really appreciate it. I mean, there's so many different places we can be sending folks to check out your work. I definitely suggest people read the whole piece, "The End of Mass Politics in Foreign Exchanges." Definitely check out American Prestige. I've been telling Danny it's been my podcast I listen to when I'm at the gym. So, you're contributing positively to this bot over here.
Yeah, I'm gonna start pumping you up. I'm gonna do like, do you remember who was it? It was Kevin Nealon who did like the subliminal message. It's like, yeah, so things are going on in Ukraine. Pump it up, David. Yeah, things
that you can check out Hinge Points, Jacobin. I mean, is there anything else that we should be directing people to, Danny? I mean,
no, that's too much already.
You're a busy man.
That's too much. Just check it out.
Well, I really appreciate you hanging out with us.
Thanks,
and
guys.
I'd love to do it again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Talk to you guys soon. Bye.
Talk to you later.